Now, in Revelation, as in everything else for Heshcel, there are many polarities, and one I didn't mention, which is the critical one, and that is that there are, how do you say, another way, that when they talk about Revelation in rabbinic literature, one of the phrases they use, which I already mentioned, is Noten HaTorah, right? God gives the Torah. This is the idea that Revelation is a monologue. God gives it. But to have the polarity, Heschel says, you need the other part of the pole. And that is called, in rabbinic Hebrew, Kabbalat HaTorah, the receiving of the Torah. You need not only the giving, but you need the receiving. The Kutzker Rebbe said, the Torah is given only once at Sinai, yet the receiving has to occur every day. Otherwise, the giving doesn't mean anything. So you have again the polarity. The giving and the receiving. And I would suggest to you that in the Orthodox view, they have, again, only one of the poles. There is only the giving. The Torah is a completely divine monologue. And that's why we can't change anything, that's why we can't argue about anything, that's why we can't interpret certain things, because there is only the giving. There is the fundamentalist, inerrant Word of God. But as Heschel shows, particularly in his Hebrew work, Torah and Hashemayim, there is the polarity. There is the divine element in the giving of the Torah, and there is the human element in the receipt of the Torah. There is the divine element in the giving of the Torah. There is the human element in the interpretation of the Torah. In the prophetic experience, the question is the prophet, as Philo says, a vessel of God? In other words, somebody who just is a receptacle for God's word? Is the prophet, as some of the rabbis put it, God's stenographer? HaKadosh Baruch Hu medaber v'hanavi kotev, God speaks, the prophet writes. Or is the prophet a partner in revelation? Are the people passive recipients of revelation, or are the people partners in revelation? And for Heschel, the answer is very clear and very simple. And that is, again, going back to this idea of the revelatory experience and of all of Judaism as being a covenant, as being rooted in a partnership between God and man. And in Who is Man? Page 75, this is what he says. Life is a partnership of God and man. God is a partner and a partisan in man's struggle for justice, peace, love, and beauty. And it is because of his being in need of man that he entered into a covenant with him for all time. A mutual bond embracing God and man, a relationship to which God, not alone man, is committed. God's dream is not to be alone, but to have humankind as a partner in the drama of continuous creation. By whatever we do, by every act we carry out, we either advance or we obstruct the drama of redemption. We either reduce or enhance the power of evil. One more quote from Man is Not Alone, page 243. God's need is a self-imposed concern. God is in need of man because God freely made man a partner in his enterprise, a partner in the work of creation. And this phrase, a partner in the work of creation, of course comes from the Talmud, the Tractate Shabbat, page 10. Yeah.
Do you ever think that as we get further away from the world that Heshcel grew up in, it's harder for us to understand what he's saying because our world is so different?
Yes, I do. And I think the world that he grew up in, American Jewry, was already far away from when he wrote a lot of this stuff. So that even though, as I mentioned yesterday, he believed that people had this natural, intuitive understanding of all this, I don't think they did, as I mentioned yesterday. Yeah, please.
But don't you think that because of that, it's even more important for us to read and understand what he says to kind of bring some of that back?
Yeah, that's why I want to give you all these keys to open it up, open up the locks there. Because, you know, he's very popular today, certainly more popular than he was when he was alive, but that doesn't mean people are reading him and understanding him. It means, as I see it, people are creating a Heshcel in their own image and making him into whatever they want him to be rather than what he is. Now, one key issue remains, which Heshcel spends a lot of time on, particularly in his Hebrew work, Torah and Hashemayim, but also in certain sections in God in Search of Man that most people have no idea what the hell is going on there. And that is when he raises the question of what, when he's talking about revelation, he's talking about the Torah being revealed. The obvious question is, so what is this Torah that is revealed? What is this Torah that is revealed? And a hint of his views is already implicit in the title, Torah and Hashemayim, the Torah from heaven. In that book, Heshcel brings an enormous amount of sources from Talmudic and Jewish mystical literature to put forth the view, which is a view very well known in the Jewish mystical tradition, but not very well known elsewhere. The view that there is a heavenly spiritual Torah, and that the Torah that we have is not that Torah. It's all in God in Search of Man, clearly in English, and nobody picks it up. But in Torah Hashemayim, called in English for some bizarre reason Heavenly Torah, you have all the sources in rabbinic literature where this idea is developed. And later the idea is developed further in Capitalistic literature. In other words, the idea is that there is a Torah in heaven, which is a purely spiritual Torah. That's the real Torah. And that what we have down here is a version of that Torah operating in a world, our world, which is obviously not totally spiritual. In other words, it's a Torah that is, as the Kabbalists put it, it's a Torah that is vested in the sense of being clothed, that is clothed in the accoutrements of our corrupted world to operate here. So it's not for a perfect world. It's for a corrupted world, which is our world. So it's a corrupted version of the Torah. It's the Torah in exile, just as the Shekhinah God is in exile because of our corrupted world. So the Torah, in order to operate in our corrupted world, has to be given to us in a corrupted form and deal with human corruptions. How do you deal with human corruptions? like murder, rape, robbery, war. If ours were a perfect world, we wouldn't need these rules. And I don't want to get into it because I know it's a sensitive issue, at least on this side of the table. But that's why we're against vegetarianism. Because vegetarianism is the Torah for the Messianic world. In our
We're
world,
supposed to be partners to help get.
no, in our world, since the flood and Mala'ah Haaretz Hamas, the world is full of corruption, we're allowed to eat meat.
We are allowed.
We are allowed,
Absolutely.
for sure.
I mean, the closest I ever came to punching somebody was when some bimbo Baal Tshuva comes over to me and tells me a brisket is treif. I said, go to my grandmother and tell her a brisket is treif. She'll punch you out. She wouldn't punch you out.
You'll be an idiot vegetarian.
Yeah.
Yes, I know. So this idea,
Rabbi, saw a sign that said vegetarian is an old Indian word for bad hunter.
Buy
I've never heard
t-shirts
that
like
before.
that in Arizona.
So when we talk about Torah Bashamayim, the Torah in heaven, Torah min hashamayim, the Torah from heaven, the idea is that it's still there. That's not what we have. What we have is the addition of that, so to speak, the corrupted addition for our corrupted world. Now, one example of this in the Midrashic literature, in the Capitalistic literature that Heshcel brings a lot of sources on, in Torah and Hashemayim, it has to do with the commentators to what happens when he breaks the tablets, when Moses breaks the tablets. You remember he comes down from the mountain with the stones written by whom?
God.
The finger of God. God himself wrote that those, and the whole Torah, according to tradition, is on those tablets, not simply the Ten Commandments, the whole Torah. And Moses looks at the golden calf and breaks the tablets. So the rabbis, they have a big problem with this. Moshe Rabbeinu just goes up to Sinai and gets the Torah from God, written with the finger of God, the most precious thing in the world, and just because he has a temper, he breaks them? I mean, if somebody gave you a big jar from the Ming Dynasty worth $100 million, and you saw your kid put ink on the carpet, would you break it because she got mad? I mean, if you have the most precious thing in the world in your hand, you break it because you're mad. How does Moses dare do such a thing? So this is a big problem for the commentators, and I won't go into all their views on it. But one view is the view that becomes dominant in Kabbalah, and this is discussed in great detail by Gershon Shalom in his essay on the Torah in Jewish mystical tradition. That what happens after Moses breaks the tablets? God says, all right, now you, Moses, you go and write a second set of what I told you in the first set. And the commentators take this to mean that the first set was the set written by the finger of God, meaning it was the totally spiritual version of the Torah for our world. Not the heavenly version, but a version which is for a totally spiritual world down here. Namely, what's the totally spiritual realm down here? The Messianic age. In other words, the Messianic age was supposed to start right then. after all the people got out of Egypt, they got the Torah at Mount Sinai. Now the Messianic age would start with the giving of the perfect Torah for the perfect spiritual world, and, you know, everything would be hunky-dory. Then Moses sees the golden calf, and he realizes that people aren't ready for the Messianic age. They're not ready to accept the rules of the spiritual Torah. They're not ready to be vegetarians. And he says, well, this Torah is not going to work here, so he destroys it. Can't work in this world. This world is too corrupt. People could never, you know, live in accordance with Torah for a perfect, idealistic, messianic, spiritualized world. And so God agrees with this and says to Moses, now, I'm not going to write the next set. You're going to write the next set because you need a human being to write the Torah that's going to be for this corrupted world. You need a human document. You need a document written by a human being, reflecting the corruption of human beings, but somehow related to what I gave you in the first set. In other words, something that can operate in our world. And the Zohar interprets this to mean that the Torah is now robed in the clothing of this world, in the accoutrements of this world, to operate in this world. It's not a perfect document for a perfect world. It's a spiritual document in a corrupted form that can operate in our world. And that's why the Kabbalists, and earlier the rabbis, had the idea that when the Messianic age comes, the Torah is going to be different. And that's the big claim of Christianity, that Jesus brought the new Torah for the Messianic age. The New Testament, the new Torah, the new gospel for the new age. Because you have a Messianic world, you need a new Torah. And the late Rabbi Walter Wurzburg put it very well. He was once asked, what's the difference between Jewish ethics and Christian ethics? He said, Christian ethics believes we live in a Messianic world. That's why it can't work. Jewish ethics believes we live in a messy world. And that's why it works. Because it's already built, it's already constructed, it's formulated to deal with the foibles and the corruptions and the sins and the problems and all the stuff that is characteristic of our world. So this is a very sophisticated theological idea, that the Torah exists in a variety of forms, on a variety of levels. A totally spiritual level, a level where you have a sort of symbiosis of the spiritual and the material and the physical, which can ideally work in this world. That's the Messianic Torah. And then the Torah that we actually have, which is a corrupted form for our world. And you have this expressed in a whole variety of ways in Capitalistic and later in Hasidic thought. I'll just mention two of them, which I find absolutely fascinating. One is the idea that, you have this in Levi Yitzchak or Dietrich teachings, that when you look at a Torah scroll, what do you see? You see the letters, right? And they're all black. And Levi Yitzchak says, in the Messianic age, what will be revealed to us is the meaning of the white spaces between the letters. In other words, now we're trying to figure out what are the meaning of all those letters. But in the Messianic age, the whole Torah will be revealed, not only the letters, but the white spaces between the letters. And another version of this is the idea, a very fascinating idea, found in some very obscure texts, that, you know, in Hebrew, there are how many letters?
22.
22. 23rd letter will be revealed in the Messianic age. And it'll be put in its proper place in each word in the Torah, where it should be. And that'll change the whole meaning of the whole Torah. There are other versions of this I don't want to get into because it's beyond our purview. So again here, you see an example of how Heshcel's theology, expressed in God in Search of Man, expressed certainly in Torah Shamayim, is very heavily informed by not only rabbinic but also Capitalistic and Hasidic teachings. Mr. Gonzalez, did you have a question?
Yeah. So Heshcel is gathering the sparks through social action, and MLK is trying to establish the kingdom of God? Would that be a very simplistic way of...
No, he wasn't. It's interesting you say that, because the idea of gathering the sparks is rooted in Lurianic Kabbalah. But it comes into Hasidism, Lurianic Kabbalah, only with the Maggid of Mezrich in the 2nd century. The Baal Shem Tov was not influenced by Lurianic Kabbalah. And therefore Heschel does not really focus on Lurianic Kabbalah as being an idea endemic to Hasidism. Because remember, he wanted to write that great book on the Baal Shem Tov. Secondly, in Hasidism, the idea of the sparks is different than in Lurianic Kabbalah. In Lurianic Kabbalah, the idea of the sparks is that there are the sparks from the breaking of the vessels that you have to redeem, and they're scattered all over the world. And every time you do a good deed, you help in the process of redemption. You don't necessarily redeem them, but you further the process of redemption. And so when Heshcel says every time you do a good deed, you accelerate the process of redemption, every time you do a sin, you retard the process, this is clear Lurianic Kabbalah. But the Hasidic idea of the sparks is that the sparks are individualized. In other words, that there are sparks connected to each individual soul that only that person can redeem. And that's your mission in life. You have to redeem your own sparks. There are no generic sparks. And when each person redeems their own sparks, that's when the Messianic era comes. Not when you redeem all the generic sparks. So in Hasidic stories, for example, if somebody, for example, gets a call to go on a business trip or a vacation or something to some strange place they've never been before, they would interpret this to mean in that place there must be some sparks relating to that person, maybe from a previous life, and he has to go there. His mission is to redeem those sparks while he's there. And if you fail, the whole world suffers. Because unless all these individuals redeem all the sparks connected with them, then, the game is over. So, for him, no, the social action won't do it. The other reason it won't do it is because in Heshcel's view, following very traditional views, the task of the human being is not to bring the Messianic redemption. The task of the human being is to make the world prepared, to make the world ready for Messianic redemption. And then it's God's call whether the Messianic redemption will commence. So the human being's role is only to prepare the house, not to bring Messianic redemption into the house. That's for God. There was another hand, yeah.
So a little...
Bon voyage.
Thank you.
I hope it's warmer there than
It's not.
Have a good trip.
So a little surprised, so...
You have a coat somewhere, right?
Yeah. So how do we do this? When Jewish perfection is whole, right?
Yes.
Wholeness. And so I'm having a little problem with making the Torah for this world. Why you use that word corrupt, because I think a case could be made that Torah helping us get through this world is even better than some abstract, dualistic Greek idea of a perfect Torah that is all ideal. I'm confused.
Well, perfect is a bad word. Let's say what I think I said was totally spiritual. That up there is the totally spiritual Torah. Then look at it this way. Look at it like a combination of the spiritual and the material, or the spiritual and the heavenly and the earthly. The Torah that's up there in the heaven is totally spiritual, and it therefore operates up there. The Torah that has some mixture of the spiritual and the let's say material, but the spiritual is still the dominant part. That's the Messianic Torah, which we don't have yet. But the mixture that we have now reflects the mixture of good and evil in our world. And the presumption is that since the Messianic era isn't here yet, the bad guys are winning. And therefore the corruption or the sin or the whatever you want to call it, the materialistic of that part of the mixture is greater than in the other levels.
Well, I see that as our problem, not Torah's problem.
It's not our, say that again?
I see the corruption as our problem, humans' problem.
Right.
I don't,
If it
it
wasn't,
sounds like Torah isn't,
Torah deals with realities, like that's why you have death penalty and things like that.
Right.
right.
Totally spiritual, it would be all about like what the Christian would say, like grace and all that.
Right, I know, but my sense is that Jewish rejected that idea of totally pure, separate spiritual.
No, it didn't. You see, you don't get it. It didn't
You're right.
reject it, but it said the difference is it's beyond our experience.
Okay.
We're not there.
It's not realistic.
You know, the Christian saint, he's there.
Right.
Our saints are not there. We had them. It's beyond our ken, and there are things that are knowable that are beyond our ken. But, like the French thinker Valéry said, people have to live in the times to which they are condemned to be born. So we're all condemned to be born in a corrupt world. And the Torah that we have works because it's constructed to guide us in a certain way of behavior through this corrupt world.
So that makes it better to me. For our situation.
Well, I wouldn't say better. I would say it's obviously more relevant to us than the spiritual Torah. And what I'm saying is, based on what Mr. Gonzalez just said, is that, in my view, the Christians, mix it up. They think they can accomplish this spiritual business here and have these moral absolutes here that aren't operative here. And in my view, because they aim for spiritual absolutes that are beyond our abilities in this world, they always fall into the opposite. I mean, if you have, celibacy as an attempt to live a totally spiritual life on the assumption that marriage is a corruption of the spirit and all this, like St. Paul says, I think, and if you're going to buy all the Greek lines, where, remember, for Plato, what's the highest human love? An older man for a little boy. So why would you be surprised that there are child molesters in the priesthood? When they're coming out of a Greek, tradition where this is all the ideal love, and where they're trying to be, totally spiritual in a way that is asking too much.
That's what led to my question.
All right, so we have the Torah we need, that we have, but if we would say that our Torah is an absolutely true one, or perfect one, then we're making, the one that we have, we're making a mistake. But in this view, if we were also going to say there is no such thing as a perfect one, a totally spiritual one, we'd also be making a mistake. We just don't have access to it. And there's no way we can have access to it. Franz Rosenzweig used to say, truth is a noun only to God. To human beings, it's an adjective. In other words, human beings can never know the truth because our minds and intellectual abilities are limited. So we can never know the truth. We can only know truths, or truths with a little t, or what Martin Buber called moment truths. But the truth, we can never know. And I would suggest that this is the problem the Christians have, because they have a dogmatic system where they claim to know the truth. And our view is we don't know the truth. And it's interesting to me, as a scholar, that the basic premise of this approach to the Torah is that no matter how great a scholar you are, if you're the greatest scholar that ever lived, let's say you're a scholar of the Torah, no matter how great a scholar you are, whether you're Soloveitchik or Moshe Feinstein or I don't know who, you never really understand the Torah. Because the only thing you can possibly understand is the corrupted version of it that we have. That one, or even the Messianic one, with the 23rd letter, or the white spaces, no clue, no matter how great a scholar you are. So it's a very humbling thing, and it sets the whole tradition in a different framework. And Heshcel develops these ideas in his work, and they're all rooted in Capitalistic ideas, and those Capitalistic ideas are in turn rooted in rabbinic literature.
In the Jewish theology class with Dr. Merriman, I don't know who he was quoting, but he said that a mystic was someone who had a glimpse of revelation, and a prophet was one who had not a dream, but like a vision of revelation. So is there something within Heshcel that we get glimpses of the heavenly Torah?
No, I wouldn't accept that. I don't know where he got it either, and I wouldn't accept it. Maimonides would say that prophets have glimpses of revelation, and the greater you are as a prophet, the greater is your glimpse. I don't know where he got it. I can ask him, but I don't see any foundation for it.
Did the prophets ever come close to seeing the heavenly Torah or partaking of it?
Only Moses. Because they have this idea there are 49 gates to the Torah, there are 50 gates to the Torah, and even Moses only got to the 49. Yeah.
Of the Kabbalists in the Zohar or whatever attempt to see beneath the garments, to use the language there, see this more spiritual interpretation of the Torah.
Yes, but that's also the spiritual, that's the interpretation for this world. That's not the absolute Torah. Let me give you an example. I really don't want to get off on this too much, but since you seem interested in it, I'm fascinated by it. I don't know if any of you ever heard of the Capitalistic work Sefer Tmunah. Maybe 20 people in the world heard of it, you know. 30 now.
Everybody took your
There's a
class.
medieval Kabbalistic book, Sefer Tmunah, means the book of the picture. And it says like this. This is such a mind-blowing idea. You know, if you told this to most people, they wouldn't believe there's such an idea, but it is there. Anyway, here's the idea. I'll give you the simple version of it. It's much more complex than this. This is in a commentary to the laws, believe it or not, of crop rotation.
What?
Crop rotation. What's the laws of crop rotation in the Torah?
7 years.
You have cycles, and the cycles are 7 years each. And each cycle is divided into two parts. First part is 6 years, where you plant, and then the 7th year, which, what happens? Let it lie fallow. And how many cycles of this do you have? 7 cycles. And then at the end of the 7th cycle, what do you get? The Jubilee. The Yovel. And at the Yovel, what happens to the land? Goes back to its original owner, whoever originally owned it. Along comes the Sefer Tmunah. Says, this must have a deeper meaning. You think all God cared about was agriculture? Such a prosaic thing? It must have a deeper meaning. What's the deeper meaning? This is the whole history of the universe. And instead of being 50 years, it's 50,000 years. So there are eons, and all history is divided into eons. There are 7 eons of 7,000 years each. And each of those eons is divided into two parts, 6,000 years of history and 1,000 years of messianic age. These eons are influenced, like an astrology almost, by the different sphirot, the lower 7 sphirot. We, today, are living in eon number 3, which is governed by the Sphira of Din, divine judgment. And that's why we have all of these terrible things happening all the time. That's its answer to the problem of evil. We're living in the evil empire. We're living in the evil eon. So harsh things are going to happen. The next eon will be governed by the Sphira of Chesed, of divine love, and mercy. So it'll be a very loving, wonderful eon, but that's not our, as people say, not my world. Now, here comes the big thing. There's a statement in Nachmanides' introduction to the Torah where he says the Torah is, and it becomes later a very basic Kabbalistic idea, the Torah is one long name of God. And if you figured out, what it's all about, you could create the world. You could create the universe. You could do whatever you want. It's like the genetic code almost. Now we don't know what the order of the letters is in that one long name of God. We don't know. But, says the Sefer Tmunah, in each eon, the letters of God's name are the same for each eon, but in each eon they're in a different order. So therefore, what the Torah says in each eon is different and is relevant relative to the sphere under which it's operating. So the Torah that we have is all these letters configurated in a way that is relevant to an eon influenced by extreme divine justice. And in the next eon, the letters will all be the same, but they'll be in a different order, so all the laws of the Torah will be different. In other words, in our eon we need a law like don't murder, because people murder. In the next eon they won't murder, so you won't need it. So the letters will all be the same, because they're all part of the same name, but and in each eon they're in a different order. And then when you get to the Yovel, the Jubilee, everything goes back to its owner, namely the letters go back to the original order they are before the first eon. Isn't that a mind-blowing idea?
Mm-hmm.
That's their idea of the Torah.
And who is this again?
It is the Sefer Tmunah, the book of the picture.
But written by who?
We don't know.
You wouldn't put your name on it either.
I mean, in the Middle Ages, we don't know who wrote most things. Now, one other question that comes from all of this for Heshcel is, when we look at the text of the Torah, what do we do about modern biblical criticism? So far, we haven't said anything about it. What about the documentary hypothesis? What about comparative Semitic philology? What about biblical history? What about all these other things? In Heavenly Torah, page 258, Heshcel responds to this issue. And he says, the essence of our faith is the sanctity of the Bible, is that which God wants us to know and to fulfill. But how these words were written down is not the fundamental problem. This is why the theme of biblical criticism is not the theme of faith. So for Heshcel, the person of faith, the person who has experienced the presence of God in their lives, really understands the Bible better and on a different level than the biblical scholar who has not had that experience of faith.
Do you think you could do it both? That there are, I'm thinking of people I knew who, I would say, bought into modern biblical criticism and were people saw it as more than.
No, I think you could. But what he's saying is that a lot of people think the way to understand the Bible is not through trying to, empathize with the consciousness of biblical thinking, not to get into biblical thinking, but rather to dissect biblical language. And if that's all you're going to do, you're never going to understand it, no matter how well you understand the words and the philology and the history and all that other stuff. So he's not discounting this, he's just saying that this is not, that you shouldn't think that this is, the primary key. Yeah.
I have a friend who's, his mom is Jewish and his dad is Muslim, and he's an atheist. And he refuses to watch the new Noah movie because he thinks it's just a big joke. And to me, it's like he's not even trying to even see what they're trying to say or what could have the story been about. He just sees it as ancient mythology, and he doesn't even want to give it a chance. So I think that in a modern context, a lot of people, because of biblical criticism and other things, with their own biases, they just dismiss the Bible without even giving it a chance.
Well, I'll buy that.
Is it time for break?
You read my mind. I was just going to ask if there are any more questions.
She did?
All right. I'm going to partially skip topic 4 on the who is man thing, because I've already discussed a lot of it. But I don't want to leave it completely. And there's one quote I want to bring to your attention. And that is that Heshcel wrote a lot, obviously, on human nature, or what in Europe was called philosophical anthropology. An area that he got involved in through his teacher, David Coit. But what I find very intriguing, amongst other things, besides his views, and we've discussed some aspects of them already, what I find very intriguing is that a lot of his writings about human nature are found as part of his writings about religious education in general and Jewish education in particular. If you look at some of the essays, in The Insecurity of Freedom about human nature, is an essay there, The Sacred Image of Man, very well footnoted essay. You'll find that most of those essays originally were given either to groups of Jewish educators or groups of interfaith educators who were members of the Religion Education Association. So it's clear to me that he saw a very important nexus between the nature of the human being and what we should be teaching children about religion. And he says this point blank in his book Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity on page 157 in his address to the principals of Solomon Schechter schools. He says, if you were to ask me what I should teach first to young people about Jewish theology. Now, first of all, he had to make the case that they should be teaching anything about Jewish theology to young people, because if you look in the curriculums of the Jewish schools, there's hardly anything there about Jewish theology. He says, if you ask me what I should teach first to young people about Jewish theology, I would say, teach the concept of man. The Bible is God's anthropology. The central issue in the Bible is man. Unless we understand the essential biblical claims concerning man, we cannot teach Jewish theology. What is the essential claim? It is the infinite importance of man. What man can do and how a person can act. The young person must be provided with a tremendous sense of importance regarding his life, his existence, and the earnestness of being alive. And this is the central statement of the Bible. The central statement of the Bible is that God is in search of man, and that man is a need of God. Now, I think it's impossible to understand Heschel's views of social action or activities in social action without understanding his idea of human nature. Because ethics basically is a concretization and articulation of a view of human nature. You can't expect a human being to act in certain ways unless you first have an idea of what is the nature of the human being. That the deeds of the human being articulate the nature of the human being. So you first have to figure out what is the nature. In Jewish sources, all of this derives from interpretations of the verse that says in Genesis that human beings are created in the image of God. So therefore you already have a nexus between the theology and the philosophical anthropology. In other words, as soon as you say the human being is created in the image of God, and the basis of ethics is the idea of what is the human being, then if the human being is created in the image of God, you first have to have a God idea in order to know in what image are you talking about. So you have, on one level, the theological idea per se, the idea of God. Then you have the human being in the image of God, namely the philosophical anthropology. And then the idea of ethics, meaning the concretization and expression and articulation in deeds of the human being and the expectations of human behavior. Now, everybody always quotes the verse, you should love your neighbor as yourself, from Leviticus. But people forget what the second part of the verse is. You should love your neighbor as yourself. What's the rest of the verse?
For I am the Lord.
I am the Lord your God. And the Avot Rabbi Natan translates that verse, which we all know and all quote, you should love your neighbor as yourself, I am the Lord your God, as you should love your neighbor as yourself because I am the Lord your God. So here again you have the theological premise underlying the notion of human nature and underlying the whole idea of ethics and interpersonal relationships. if you have the idea, as we discussed before, I raised it already, of the apathetic God, that God is apathetic, that God is beyond relationship, then if the human being is in the image of God, you have no basis for relationship. But, so therefore, how you portray God in a religious system where the human being is viewed as being created in the image of God, your theology determines your philosophical anthropology, and it determines your ethics. If you make a statement that God is echad, meaning unique, one of a kind, and the human being is created in the image of God, as you have in that famous statement in the Talmud and Tractate Sanhedrin, page 37a, that each human being is unique. That's only because you first posited the view that God is unique. If you say that one of the characteristics of God is that God is holy, God is kadosh, what does that mean when you translate it into saying that the individual human being, the individual life, is holy? Or that the individual human life has an intrinsic sacredness? What kind of life do we consider intrinsically sacred? If human life is intrinsically sacred, then it's holy because it's in the image of God, which is holy. And one of the meanings that the Hebrew word kadosh, holy, has, linguistically, is set apart or unique, one of a kind. So, how you think about God determines how you think about human nature, and then how you think about ethics. Heshcel is very influenced, as I mentioned the other day, by Rabbi Judah of Prague of the 16th century, who had the view that the basic characteristic of God is that God is a free creative being. And this leads to the idea that the human being is a free creative being. Also, I want to remind you, we discussed this already, and that is where the idea of the human being relates to the idea of polarity. That the human being expresses a polarity between a being who is created in the image of God on the one hand, and a being who is dust and ashes on the other hand, a being who is has angelic qualities on the one hand, and a being who has animalistic qualities on the other hand. In Who is Man, for example, on page 33 and following, Heshcel lists what he considers basic characteristics of the human being, such as intrinsic sanctity, uniqueness, which again relates to his view of the category of the unique, that the human being is free and dynamic and not static, that the human being is capable of reciprocity because reciprocity is the primary ingredient for partnership. And as we saw, he defines the basis of religion as a partnership between God and human beings. I mentioned to you a number of times that through Who is Man, he has constant polemics against various people, and I think I've given a lot of examples of that, so I needn't do that again. So I think if you would read Who is Man Now, I hope that there are some keys now and tools now at your disposal so you can better understand this work, which is, in a way, as I said yesterday, his most philosophical work and rather different than most of his other works. This brings me now to the last topic, topic 5, the human response. Any questions first on this whole idea of human nature? I don't want to get into all the technicalities of how it fits into philosophical anthropology and how it is influenced by creative bargain and developing it and all this other stuff. All right. As I discussed before, for Heshcel, religion is a polarity between the divine initiative and the human response. And you can see this polarity in the titles of 2 of his books. The divine initiative is God in Search of Man. The human response is man's quest for God. In Judaism, the human response takes a variety of forms, both attitudinally and in concrete action. And some of these forms are faith, piety, prayer, and deeds. Faith, piety, prayer, and deeds. And I want to give you some examples of each, as Heshcel discusses them. Now, the polarity, of course, begins with God in Search of Man, but unless something happens from our side, there's no polarity, there's no completeness, there's no religious faith. And Heshcel expresses this a number of places in his writings by telling the famous Hasidic story about the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Baruch of Mezhbish. Don't ask me how to spell Mezhbish. The story is that the grandson of Rabbi Baruch was playing hide and seek with a friend of his. And he went to hide, expecting his friend would come and look for him. And after spending a long time in his hiding place, he came out of the hiding place, seeing that his friend never came to look for him. And he ran to the study of his grandfather, crying and complaining about his friend. And when hearing the story, Rabbi Baruch started to cry. And the boy said, "Grandfather, why are you crying?" And Rabbi Baruch said, "Because God also says, I hide and no one comes to look for me." So the idea is, unless we look, that God can be in search of us, but unless we reciprocate, unless there is the partnership, unless we respond, unless we realize that God is waiting for us to seek Him, the phenomenon of religious life is not complete. Now, how do we seek Him? Heshcel identifies 3 paths to God in Judaism. The first is the world, nature. The second is the Word, meaning prayer and study. We discussed this a little before, the Word. And the third is the deed, the action, the mitzvah. So first, the world. Here Heschel more or less takes the view of Maimonides that I mentioned earlier, namely that contemplation of creation leads one to contemplation of the Creator. That in looking at the world, in looking at the natural world, we react with awe, wonder, and what he calls radical amazement, which brings us, hopefully, into a relationship with the Creator. And here, in a number of his works, particularly in Man is Not Alone, he tells the story of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, which was told originally by Nachman of Bratslav, about a prince who was exiled from his father, the king. And he missed his father. And he said he started to cry. And his advisor said, "Why are you crying?" And he said, "I miss my father, the king, and he's very far away from him." And the messenger and the servant said to the prince, "But we have just received a letter from your father. Here, read the letter." And he looked at the letter and he was happy because the letter was written by the hand of the king. And Nachman of Bratslav says, the world is God's letter to us. Creation is God's letter, written by God's hand. And therefore, through the letter, we can apprehend the presence of the author of the letter, the author of nature, namely God. But, Heschel reminds us, the biblical view, unlike the view in ancient Near Eastern religions, particularly Babylonian and Canaanite religion, is that creation is not equivalent to the Creator. That one of the big innovations of Judaism in the ancient world was that God transcends creation. That God created creation, made creation, rather than that God is nature, that God is part of the natural world. And so for Heschel, creation is not an end in itself, as it is rather a means towards an end, and the end is a relationship with the Creator. So Heschel makes again a distinction between Greek thinking and biblical thinking, in that in Greek thinking, the big issue is what is the relationship of the human being to the cosmos, and the big issue in biblical tradition is what is the relationship of the human being to God. Then you have the second path, namely the Word. What's presumed here is the presence of God in the sacred Word. In other words, the view that the Word, the sacred Word, whether it's the word of prayer or the word of Torah, the word of study, the Word is a rendezvous point for where the human being can meet God. And because, as I mentioned before, in study God speaks to us, for the rabbis, study is superior even to prayer. That's why in Jewish law, if you have money only to build a school or a synagogue, a house of prayer, you have to build a school first. Because study is the paramount commandment. Like the Talmud puts it, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, that study is the greatest of all the commandments. because that's where we hear the word in the study. Then you have the third place, namely the deed. The deed is the way in which we witness the presence of God in the world in a concrete way. Because the deed is not abstract. The deed is not a concept. And I, yesterday, gave you this Advash business, where the mitzvah becomes the ineffable name of God. In doing the finite deed, the mitzvah, we articulate the infinite. In other words, we are not allowed to say the infinite, the ineffable name of God anymore, but every time we do a mitzvah, we are in fact saying it. We are in fact expressing it. Now, in this regard, regarding the deed, we have in Hasidism, and Heshcel has this idea a number of places in his writings, but doesn't footnote it. We have in Hasidism, again, a very, I would say, I don't know what word to use, idea, intriguing. The Baal Shem Tov, about the deed. There are basically two kinds of deeds. There's the good deed, the mitzvah, and there's the bad deed, the sin, right? So, how do we view the sin? Baal Shem Tov pointed out that the word for sin in Hebrew is hey. Word for sin is hey. Now, Baal Shem Tov says, if we did have the olive, it would still be fake, right? It would still be pronounced fake. So what do we need the olive there for? Now, in normal rabbinic Hebrew, the letter Hey is the abbreviation for God, right? But in Hasidic Hebrew, the Aleph is the abbreviation for God, because it's an abbreviation of the phrase Alufo Shel Olam, master of the world, leader of the world. It's a rabbinic phrase, a midrashic phrase, Alufo Shel Olam. It sounds strange to modern Hebrew. Israelis don't understand it, because in modern Hebrew, an aluf is a general in the army. But in classical Hebrew, it's a leader of the world, the top guy in the world, whatever, the master of the world. So in Hasidic Hebrew, the Aleph is an abbreviation for God. So the Baal Shem Tov said, this is his, and Heshcel says, this is the definition of a sin, following the Baal Shem Tov. A sin is putting God in a place where God doesn't belong. In other words, the olive is the symbol for God. We don't need it in the word faith. It still says faith. So why is it there? Because even a sin can't exist without God being present in it. Because without God's presence, nothing can exist. Even a sin can't exist. So what is a sin? A sin is putting God in a place where he doesn't belong. If you ever have a good sermon on Yom Kippur, there it is. Now let's move to Heschel's view of faith. And again here we find, though he doesn't discuss it anywhere, his various phenomenological levels. Faith, in his view, does not occur on the pre-reflective level, but but rather on the descriptive level. So here you have the three levels. On the pre-reflective level, he says you have awe. You have what's called in Hebrew yirah, awe. When you're having awe of God, you're not thinking about it, you're just having it. Awe being a word terribly misused today. Faith is on the descriptive level. And what's on the reflective level? Belief. Belief relates to the content of the faith. And that's why Heshcel says faith in Judaism is a verb. It's an action. It's something you do. Not a noun, not an abstraction, not something you have. It's something you live, not something you have. And in God in Search of Man, page 152, he writes, there is no faith at first sight. Because in his view, faith is an effort. It's a struggle. And here again we have a polarity, the polarity between faith and doubt. In other words, doubt makes faith possible. Faith exists together with doubt. Faith also, in his view, exists as a challenge to the presence of evil and the presence of absurdity. Faith, as we already discussed, is a memory of an event. Now, in his book, on the Rabbi of Kutz, Passion for Truth, by the way, originally his book, Passion for Truth, was supposed to be called The Passion for Sincerity, but it came out after he died in '73, during the whole business with the Nixon impeachment, and the publisher felt that Passion for Truth would resonate better than Passion for Sincerity. Because nobody accused Nixon of being insincere, they just accused him of not telling the truth. In that book, he gives you the Kutzker Rebbe's definition of faith, which is a very uncomfortable definition, which is, having faith is like being a woman in childbirth who cannot deliver. In other words, it's not a pleasant experience, it's a wrestling. It's a struggle. You know, it's not have faith and be calm and believe, and all your questions are answered. It's a struggle. And the paradigm is always Jacob wrestling with the angel. This is the continuous wrestling with faith. Faith is a wrestling. Faith is a response to God, so it's on the other side of revelation. Faith is a reciprocity. Faith, he says in one place, is faithfulness. For example, suppose I have a catechism, and I say, this expresses my faith. How can I verify that? Just because I say I believe in those things, does that verify them? Heschel's view, rather, is that the way you verify what you say you believe, how you verify what you say you have faith in, is by deeds, by how you live, by consistency between what you state and what you live. Or, as he put it once, a person should be what he prays, and live what he says. So the way you verify faith is not simply an intellectual assent, it's a verification through deeds. Faith is not an intellectual exercise, but rather an existential commitment.
Yep.
Could you just repeat the level 2 word you used? I mean, you said on the pre-reflective, you're on the reflective level, it's the action of belief, the doing. I forgot. On the descriptive level,
Faith.
It's faith. Faith is a verb.
that's
You haven't talked about belief.
I haven't talked about what?
Belief. You want
that's
it?
action.
No, belief is theology. Belief is the content of what you have faith in.
Mhm.
Belief is, the conflict between doubt and faith. It's how to reconcile the problem of evil with the faith claims that you make.
Oh,
That's where the wrestling comes in. That's where the analysis comes in. That's where the critique comes in. That's the hard part. That now leads to piety. For Heshcel, piety means how to live the life of faith. In Moral Grandeur, page 305 and following, you have one of Heschel's first essays written in English and published in 1942. Later expanded as the last chapter of Man is Not Alone, as a summation and a goal of the religious life. Namely, if the goal of the religious life is to live the pious life, we must first have some idea of the nature of piety, or what we aspire for in the religious life. And here, in this essay on piety, Heshcel explicitly uses the phenomenological method by trying to describe the consciousness of a pious person that accompanies his actions and his lifestyle, and on the reflective level, a classification of the concepts, this is his term, a classification of the concepts latent in his mind. In composing this essay, Heshcel primarily relies on what he saw growing up amongst Hasidim. He's trying to describe the consciousness of the pious people he knew, which for him epitomized the acme of Jewish spiritual life. And in particular, the person he had in mind, that is, the consciousness he is analyzing and describing here, is his uncle, who he considered the paradigm of piety, namely the Novominsker Rebbe, whose name, by the way, was also Abraham Joshua Heschel. The polemic here is implicit but becomes more explicit in A Passion for Truth, where Heshcel, through the lens of the Kutzker Rebbe, talks about the low level of piety and the low level of spirituality in the contemporary Jewish community. Namely, the absence of religious leaders who can serve as role models. Because in his view, if the religious life is not meeting its goal, namely of attaining leaders attaining piety, then religion becomes, in his term, the messenger who forgot the message. Religion is failing itself. And you see this view in the very opening paragraph of God in Search of Man, where he says, if religion is failing, it's its own fault. It's because it has failed itself. So you see here a juxtaposition between the life of piety and the life of the religious life of Jews in America when he wrote Passion for Truth in the 70s. And in this essay on piety, you see clearly the juxtaposition between the assumptions rooted in building a life of faith and piety on the one hand, and how things are actually operating in the religious life of American Jewry on the other hand. So for Heschel, piety is the critical ingredient in the religious life, and yet pious people are an endangered species. Now, what are some of the ingredients that he identifies as being endemic to piety? First is that the pious person life is theocentric rather than self-centered. Centered on God and God's needs rather than us and our needs. And this leads him to a sentence you find in many places in his work expressing this, when he writes, "God is of no importance unless God is of supreme importance." So the fundamental question he asks here is not how can a person fulfill their needs, but rather how can a person articulate through his or her life and deeds God's concerns and God's will and God's plan. Secondly, is attachment to the transcendent. And here you have the theme that Hell builds his whole book about. That the basic idea, according to Hell for Heschel, is to transcend the self, to transcend the culture, to transcend society, and particularly to transcend the ego. What does this entail? The attachment to the transcendent. It entails the focus on God rather than the self, the focus on God's will rather than individual autonomy. So here you can see a polemic against the Kantians. You can also see a sharp distinction between Heschel's view and all the sociological studies today of American Jewry, which all talk about the whole idea which they call the sovereign self. This is the exact opposite of building a Jewish life around the sovereign self. Living a life in awareness of God, a life compatible with God's presence, a life based on a posture of humility rather than self-satisfaction or arrogance. Viewing the world from a transcendent perspective, I would say, not playing Trivial Pursuit. Allowing the person to rise above his or her daily experiences and transient petty needs. Not asking the question, what do I want, but what would God want me to do? Not escaping from the world, but acting as God's agent through the articulation of God's will in deeds to improve the lives of others and the world. And finally, taking nothing for granted, rather being grateful for all that one has, renouncing acquisitiveness, and accepting rather the gift of life and the love of giving. Now, this leads Heschel to ask the obvious question, what are the results of a life of piety? And here's what he has to say. First, the pious person doesn't have to engage in the quest for meaning because he's already found it. And that is in his relationship with God. Because God is the ultimate source of meaning. Secondly, the person doesn't have to look for a mission statement in life, because he already has a mission statement in life, which is provided by the tradition. Thirdly, the pious person is able, because of his faith, to contend with transient setbacks and disappointments, because he has a strength of character that comes from faith and self-transcendence. Fourthly, and this is very Hasidic, the pious person never gets depressed. Depression is the greatest sin in Hasidism, and is considered an expression of egoism.
Expression of what?
Expression of egoism, of egocentricity. In other words, for the Hasidim, depression is a coin with two sides. On the one side is pride, and on the other side is depression. Pride is thinking you're better than you are, and depression is thinking you're worse than you are. But in both cases, all you're thinking about is yourself. So the pious person doesn't become depressed because he has meaning and mission and transcends the ego. Fifthly, living is, for the pious person, reciprocity with God. In other words, giving back to God for the gift of life. So it's reciprocity and partnership. And sixthly, the pious person does not suffer from compartmentalization, so characteristic of the modern person, because piety characterizes the whole person. The person is a holistic person, and therefore doesn't lead a compartmentalized existence where, they're vicious on one side and, compassionate on the other side. They are the way they are, all of them, the whole person. Seventhly, transcendence leads to the revelation of one's own higher self. Piety leads to a person realizing who he or she can become with our own spiritual potentials developed. So the pious person is always becoming. The pious person is always trying to realize his or her spiritual potentials. And eighthly, the life of the pious person is lived on the border between the finite and the infinite. The pious person is part of the world, but is always aiming through sacred deeds to transcend the world. The big question Heshcel leaves us with, but the answer is obvious, especially in the insecurity of freedom, is what should our religious institutions be doing in order to cultivate piety amongst their members? In other words, if you look at Jewish organizations, whether they're synagogues or whether they're defense organizations or whatever they are, if the goal of the religious life is the life of piety, what are they doing to achieve it? Or is what they're doing stifling and sabotaging? That's the question Heshcel gives you his answer about in his last book, The Passion for Truth. Any questions about any of that?
All this came from the Passion for Truth book? Everything you read before?
No. Most of it came from the Moral Grandeur essay about piety. leads now to prayer. Now, I don't know if you ever made a search of this, computer search or a library search, but if you make a study and you ask, how many studies have there been on the Jewish liturgy? How many different prayer books are there? You will find there is an immense literature. About every 20 minutes, it seems, someone's coming out with a new edition of the Torah, which is supposed to solve all of our problems about synagogue attendance. But somebody made a study I saw, not very well publicized for obvious reasons, and showed that the more we revise the prayer book, the less people are praying. Or less people at least are coming to the synagogue. So we have a lot of studies of the liturgies, but very few studies, believe it or not, on the issue of what is the nature of prayer. I mean, if you have people in a congregation and they ask you, give me a good book on Jewish prayer, mostly you'll give them a prayer book or you'll give them a commentary to the prayer book or something like this, but that's not what they're asking. They want to know, what is an authentic Jewish view? Where can I read up about an authentic Jewish view of prayer? Not a lot around.
GSM.
Pardon me?
God in Search of Man.
No, man's quest for God.
Yeah.
At least part of it. But except for that, a little book that Louis Jacobs wrote, which is out of print, and a little book by Eliezer Berkowitz, which doesn't really tackle all the sides. There's really not that much. Now, Heshcel often asked the question, suppose a person comes to you and says, how can I learn how to pray? What do? You give them a book, you give them a manual, you send them to the local synagogue. The person says to you, I want to learn how to pray. How do you respond to that? And Heschel's answer is, you tell him to pray with a person who knows how. Because for Heshcel, prayer is an art requiring certain attitudes and techniques. But today, just as piety is rare, the art of prayer is also rare. People don't know how to pray, especially, I would say, Jews. Christians, every time there's a crisis, let us pray. And then they say some stupid and inane thing. Here's Lord is your servant. JQ. And he seeks your guidance. And God, we ask your guidance in the name of our Lord, blah, blah, blah. Well, I don't find it terribly spiritually uplifting. I was watching the other day that movie about Bush 43, W, and he goes to the preacher played by Stacy Keach, and he always says to him, let's pray together. Stacy Keach always says something like that. God, help your servant W through this hard decision. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, blah, blah, blah. Well, that seems to me to be a pretty cheap shot at prayer. So how do we develop the art of prayer? Where do we find the people who know how to do it and who are skilled in this art? For Heshcel, part of the reason that prayer, the art of prayer is so rare, is because prayer is often misunderstood. And the problem of prayer is usually addressed by focusing on secondary things, like changing the prayer book, rather than thinking about prayer. So Heshcel, in his essay, In Man's Quest for God, which was originally a speech to the Rabbinical Assembly, says instead of prayer book commissions, to change the prayer book, we need prayer commissions to figure out what prayer is. Now, in his essay, In the Insecurity of Freedom, and in the essay, In Moral Grandeur, there are two essays there about prayer, pages 100 and following and pages 257 and following, you again find Heshcel doing a polemical number. For example, we all know in this country about the separation of the state and religion. And with that in mind, Heshcel begins his speech by saying the big problem we have regarding prayer is that we have a separation not only of church and state, but a separation of synagogue and God. God seems to have no home in the synagogue. There's a famous story about the Baal Shem Tov goes into this room where people are praying, and he can't enter the room. And somebody says to him, "Why can't you enter the room?" He says, "Because the room is full of prayer." I said, "Well, then you should be able to enter the room." He says, "No, it should be full of God. It's so full of the people's prayers that there's no room for me and there's no room for God." Well, I'm sure you know synagogues like that. So the question then is, if the synagogue is not primarily for prayer, what is it? And this leads Heshcel to polemicize against the very popular sociological view in American Jewry that the synagogue is the Beit Knesset. The synagogue is the house of gathering. In other words, that the synagogue is, in sociological view, the place where Jews gather. It is not primarily the place for prayer. Now here's a funny story which actually happened. I don't know if you're aware of it because it happened in Boston. I was visiting Boston years ago with my son. We were on our college shopping trip. So we were running around Boston looking at Harvard and Tufts and Brandeis and all these other places. And I wanted to see a friend of mine who was a rabbi of a synagogue there. So I opened the yellow pages under synagogues. Looking down the list for his synagogue, and I see listed under synagogues is a Buddhist temple. I said to myself, what is a Buddhist temple being listed in the yellow pages among synagogues? Must be a mistake. So there was a telephone. So I call up, I said, some nice lady answered the phone. I said, "Madam, are you aware that your Buddhist temple is listed here in the Boston Yellow Pages under in polemicizing against this view that Judaism, Jewish life, Jewish religion is basically a sociological construct. Of course, Heschel was also polemicizing against Kaplan, who in this case was drawing his views from one of the great pioneers of sociology who greatly influenced Kaplan, namely Emil Durkheim. Heschel is polemicizing against the Orthodox in this essay when he again talks, as I discussed before, about religious behaviorism, expressed here by mechanical prayer, which you're running through the liturgy so fast you can't focus on the inner life or on the inner meaning of the prayer. As I mentioned to you the other day, one of the big things now, especially amongst young Orthodox Jews, is who finds the service that's over the fastest. So like they call it davening marathon. Like running the Chicago Marathon. Who can say all the prayers fastest? And you also have Heschel here polemicizing against certain trends in Zionism, because many of the earliest trends in Zionism removed God from the prayers. For example, you heard of the Bilu movement? What was the Bilu movement? This was the movement of the great immigration from Eastern Europe to Palestine by the secular Zionists, or some call the second wave of immigration. Bilu was an abbreviation of a verse from the Bible. Beit Yisrael v'chuven elcha. Children of Israel, let's get up and go. What's missing? The rest of the verse. B'or Hashem, in the light of God. And if you look in early Zionist literature, you find this all the time. That they take traditional Hebrew phrases, traditional Hebrew poetry, traditional Hebrew prayer, and they eliminate the religion, any reference to God. Now, of course, when Heshcel wrote this in the 50s, this was a bigger trend than it is now. So for Heshcel, speaking about the nature of prayer, at the center of prayer is God. As he puts it, the issue of prayer is God. It's not social solidarity. It's not that prayer, as some studies have now, is good for your blood pressure. It's not, as Sadia supposedly said but never said, but is always quoted as saying, is an expression of self-analysis. And the final thing, since we're out of time, is the view of Yehuda Halevi, Judah Halevi, who we seem to come back to all the time, where he defines Judah Halevi, and Heschel quotes him again without citing the source, that Judah Halevi says the human being, nature of the human being is that the human being is the praying animal. Not the rational animal, not the tool-making animal, but the praying animal. The only animal that prays. And the final thought is that in rabbinic tradition, in the Talmud, prayer, as you know, replaced the sacrifices. And the word for the sacrifice in Hebrew is korban, which comes from the root karov, meaning to make closer. So prayer replaces the sacrifice, means the purpose of prayer is to move us closer to God. It's to affect the relationship with God. on that happy note.